So I realized that the really remarkable Tyler Vanderwill is going to be speaking, and he has done some incredible uh, medical epidemiological work on the impact of volunteering and giving on health. And I think it, in many ways, builds on, but also supersedes my own interest in that topic. I've always admired a particular passage from St. Paul. God loves a cheerful giver. I don't know that giving is always cheerful, and life is not always easy, but in general, when you encounter hard times, you're much better off to focus your mind and your heart on contributing to the lives of others instead of focusing on the self and the problems of the self. And lo and behold, with the passage of time, things seem to get better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about aging, health, and altruism, but then I'm going to shift to dignity for deeply forgetful people. And I'll tell you why I developed that term, deeply forgetful, as an alternative to dementia, which is an entirely negative term, a decline from a former mental state, whereas deeply forgetful is a different feel. Agape love, I'll quote John M. Templeton, who was a friend of both Harold's and myself. Agape love means feeling and expressing pure, unlimited love for every human being with no exception. Developing such divine ability has been a goal for me almost all of my 86 years on earth. Well, he passed away in 2008, and I think he really very much lived what he taught. That's Sir John in his mid 90s with his brother Harvey, who was even a little older than he was. This is from a newspaper in Tennessee. It's just classic because you can see radiance. Sir John was a very spiritual man. He was a very loving man. And I think he was a radiant soul because he was connected with something that is very mysterious in this universe, some cherishing form of love that uh, didn't just come from him, but I think he felt invaded his experience from time to time. Radiant love. Who are the happiest people you've ever met? Let us write down the names of 10 persons who continually bubble over with happiness, and we will probably find that most are men and women who radiate love for everyone. This is an image from an American artist, Norman Rockwell, The Golden Rule. He painted this in Stockbridge, Massachusetts in 1961. It appeared on the cover of Look magazine. It had tremendous impact. This is before the civil rights era in America. And you see people from every walk of life, from every religious tradition or not. You have the denim fellow scratching his chin in the middle, probably a good secular existentialist, but he's still thinking, how can I use my gifts to help others? You see women and men, you see young and old. There are no boundaries to the image. It's as though it could circle the whole universe and embrace a shared or a common humanity. You see people have a sense of peacefulness, tranquility in their countenance. And that's actually true. If you look at the studies, when people just meditate on the idea of helping others, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, they engage the mesolimbic pathway of the brain. And we know from Mike McCullough's work and others that that actually shuts off those negative pathways of the brain that are associated with bitterness and hostility and anger. So there's a passage somewhere that says perfect love casts out fear. This captures that. I had the honor, I was up in high school in New Hampshire at an Episcopal school called St. Paul's, and Rockwell actually came up from Stockbridge and he talked about this picture. This is in about 1969. And he said, do you see the white halo? Okay, everybody, do you see the white halo in this image? I'm asking. Yes, yes, yes. Well, I'll help you out. It starts with the rabbi's beard. and then it goes across to the toddler's shirt. It comes back around and up and under. And he said, I'm not particularly religious, and he wasn't particularly religious, but he said, I believe that there is a divine energy of love, and that when we focus our minds on contributing meaningfully and with purpose to the lives of others, we get into the flow of that energy. It finds us as much as we find it. And he even said it's like surfing. I don't know if they surf at Malta. I grew up surfing. You paddle so hard to catch the wave, but then when you catch the wave, it has its own energy and you just have to balance, just carries you away. And I think that's what Sir John meant by radiance. I think that if you really love your neighbor, and if you act with compassion and kindness and warmth, and have a gentle curiosity about all of your patients, even just in the little things, not developed empathy and all of the complexity of that, but just to be gently curious about the people around you, you will catch that wave, and that wave will take you on a journey your whole life long. So that was the greatness of Norman Rockwell. When I came here to Stony Brook from Cleveland, Ohio, after 20 years, I'd written Why Good Things Happen to Good People, and people from United Healthcare got in touch because they wondered, is it really true that helping others is good for the helper? So in early 2010, they conducted, I was a moderately involved consultant, not anything more than that, but they conducted a survey of about 5,000 adult Americans. They asked these Americans, did you volunteer in 2009? And 41% said they'd volunteered. How long? Well, about 100 hours. 89% agreed with this question. Volunteering improved my sense of well-being. 73% said lowered my stress level. So think back to that Rockwell image, the serenity on those faces. This captures that scientifically. 92% enriched my sense of purpose in life. I think of Donya's definition of spirituality. 68% made me physically healthier. 77% improves emotional health. 78% helps recovery from loss and disappointment. Some friends of mine did a study of widows and widowers who had been happily married for many years. It appeared in Health Psychology. And I got a call from the New York Society of Widows and Widowers. I didn't know there was such a thing. And they said, well, come in and give a plenary at our annual address. And I did. And basically people who could self-report that they were helping others in their environment, in their neighborhood, through their places of worship, their spiritual communities, they were getting through bereavement more quickly and in a more lasting way. So I thought this was just money in the bank. There was a guy in the back of the room, a couple of thousand people there, and he's frantically waving his hand. And I caught him in the corner of my eye. And he said, I don't care what you say, buddy. I don't do nothing for nothing. And I thought, this poor fellow, you could convince him that he would have all these internal benefits from being kind and helpful. But if he can't calculate it in some reciprocal fashion, give and get, then he feels like he's a fool. And there's nothing for him in it. But actually, as a byproduct, however unintended, of helping others, we do have these internal benefits. People reported better sleeping, deeper friendships. They said their friends weren't the people they partied with or just hung out with, but their friends kept them on track. Their friends were the people who said, you're kind of veering away from your values, from your true north self. And so that's what Aristotle called benevolent friendship. They reported reduced anxiety and reduced helplessness, and 25% were volunteering through their workplace. By the way, 76% of them felt better about their employer as a result. So that's really pretty astonishing. It's a simple approach to this question, is it good to be good? There are many other approaches. There are lots of population studies of older adults These have been around for something like 25 years, really beginning at the University of Michigan, but then going elsewhere. But it does turn out that older adults who can be volunteering do better with regard to mortality, depression, and so forth. That's why in a lot of assisted living programs around the US and Canada and around the world now, you'll have opportunities for older adults to be involved in pro-social activities. They're weaving the baskets for the local walkathon. They're printing on the t-shirts for some meaningful event, and they're actually, if possible, getting out and participating in those events. So there's something really powerful. This is another interesting study about preventing hypertension. It turns out that volunteering 200 hours a year indicated reduction in hypertension. That's impressive. It's quite a significant reduction, 40% less likely to have developed hypertension when compared to non-volunteers. So we have all this science, and I think that Dr. Vanderweel will do a beautiful job of presenting this. Dr. Koenig could do wonderfully well. He's contributed greatly to this field. But let's just talk about this from a little perspective. I'm going to shift gears slightly. Francis Bacon wrote The New Atlantis in 1626. It's really a biological utopia. It is the magnum opus for the biological revolution. And in The New Atlantis, there is some fabulous breakthrough that he referred to as the waters of paradise, that we would be able to drink of the waters and live forever on earth. And you have to remember that Thomas Aquinas had a number of arguments for immortality, but one of them certainly was that we have these incredibly creative minds and spirits. We can go as far as our imagination will allow us, and that's infinitely. And so we have to have immortality, spiritual immortality, because otherwise God would be frustrating our creativity in ways that are ungodlike. So he talked about the waters of paradise. And right now, the National Institutes of Aging at the NIH in the US, they spend 60% of their budget on the basic science of aging, because they're hoping that at some point they'll be able to fiddle with telomeres and other kinds of dynamic aspects of the cell and get us to a point where we are, in fact, living much longer lives, but hopefully with not protracted, but compressed morbidities. So one of my colleagues at Case Western, Bob Binstock, and I did an edited book, The Fountain of Youth, Cultural, Scientific, and Ethical Perspectives on a Biomedical Goal with Oxford. This was some years ago. And that really is a huge, big question that we all need to deal with. Now, Jonathan Swift was sarcastic, we could say, about the ideal of Bacon, because he has Gulliver come among a very unusual people. They are called Struldbrugs. Don't write that down. That means they're immortal. This is among a tribe called the Lugdagians. Every once in a while, among the Lugdagians, someone is born and they'll live forever. And the king of the Lugdagians says to Gulliver, they're immortal. And Gulliver is so happy. He's ecstatic. Oh my God, if I could live forever, I could use my gifts endlessly. But then the king says to Gulliver, wait a minute. In their 8th decade of life, these immortals lose the common appellation of things. They forget words. They can no longer engage in conversation because they forget what was said immediately earlier. And then he says, they are hated by all sorts of people. They are despised and hated by all sorts of people. When one of them is born, it is reckoned ominous, and their birth is recorded very particularly. They are the most mortifying sight I've ever beheld, and the women more horrible than the men. My keen appetite for perpetuity of life much abated. That's Gulliver speaking. And then the king says to Gulliver, send a couple of these immortals back to your own country to arm your people against the fear of death. So certainly that's the major question that science faces. Do we want to go ahead with all of the anti-aging research, which is not too successful yet, but you never know? Would that risk the protraction of morbidity or the compression? Because this is the logic. We've had such little good luck finding a solution to Alzheimer's. The pharmacy is not terribly effective. Um, uh, these things seem to linger, and there are no easy answers. But if aging itself is the major predictive factor in many of these chronic illnesses of old age, well, let's go for that. Let's get aging itself, and then maybe we'll live to be 110 or 115 on average, but we'll be lucid of mind and full of energy. That's the goal. That's Bacon's goal. But of course, aging is no panacea. And then now we'll get into the spirituality. Dementia, of course, is a syndrome or a collection of symptoms caused by many, many diseases. 100 years ago, the major course of dementia was syphilis, neurosyphilis, as they call it. Life expectancy was much lower. Now we have, of course, antibiotics. And so the causes are AD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, vascular or multi-infarct dementia. We're now discovering a lot about chronic traumatic encephalitis. Young people who get repeatedly hit on the head in hockey games or football games need to be very careful. Dr. Alzheimer himself did not think he had discovered a new disease, but rather he thought that the dementia that he found in Augusta D in 1907 was just an inevitable aspect of brain aging, and that we would all experience should we live long enough. We actually had a whole conference on Alzheimer's attitudes towards Alzheimer's disease at his birth home in Markbreich, Germany, flying over there on a Lilly Learjet about 15 years ago. So these are things to think about. Swift, though, he was a very spiritual man. He'd been on the board of Bethlehem Asylum in London, and he saw people with deep forgetfulness being abused. People were invited in, and they were throwing apples and oranges and poking them with sticks. And these individuals were left in the cool weather in the basement, so that somehow using Isaac Newton's theory of mental illness, that the cold would quicken the flow of bodily fluids, and this would in fact make them better. So much for Isaac Newton. By the way, he did say that the residents at St. Patrick's, which he found, so as he came back to Ireland, he started to lose his memory, but he wrote a beautiful will that every penny of the royalties that he gained, which was 10,000 pounds from Gulliver's and other essays, that would go to found this remarkable institution. And it was dementia specific. He wanted the people in St. Patrick's to come from the vicinity of Dublin so that their family members could visit weekly and pray with their loved ones. He quoted the Sermon on the Mount in his will, in his will, and said, non-violence. These people will not be treated violently. They will be treated with love, with kindness and generosity. And he wanted St. Patrick's built within the vicinity of a place where they could get medical care if needed. And it's only about a quarter of a mile from what's now the Museum of Dublin, but was once upon a time St. Stephen's Hospital. And then he passed away, tucked away in some nook and cranny of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. But I'm very fond of Jonathan Swift. And his St. Patrick's is renowned all across Ireland. In pretty much every county, they have these satellites. They don't overtreat. They don't use feeding pegs. They do a lot of psychosocial intervention. It's very spiritually oriented. It's a truly beautiful thing. And when I came back, I took the ferry from Dublin to Holyhead, Wales, and it was called the Jonathan Swift. And the whole cabin, which was about the size of a basketball court, was a beautiful history commemorating Jonathan Swift and his commitment and concern for the mentally ill and people with dementia and the building of St. Patrick's. I practically wept. I was so pleased to be in that room. I'll never forget it. And that's my wife's husband in front of the entrance to St. Patrick's. This is about 2000, I guess. You know, there was a wonderful physician who wrote the Nuremberg Code, Leo Alexander, MD from Tufts University. He was in the army at the time in World War II. And after the war, in 1949, he wrote a beautiful article in the New England Journal of Medicine, Medical Science Under Dictatorship. And he pointed out the horrors that, for example, in the Tiergestrasse 4, the T4 project in Berlin, which only lasted 18 months, there were 70,000 people taken out of asylums. Half of them, Mueller-Hill points out, had probable developmental cognitive disabilities. Half of them had dementing type of conditions. And they were the victims of the hypothermia experiments. They were left to freeze in vats of ice water. They were left lying in the snow. And then they would be brought back into the asylum and thawed out, warmed up at different temperatures and different gradients, hot air, water, and so forth. And this was ostensibly to know at what point it would be futile to send rescuers into the icy waters of the North Atlantic to rescue downed planes or possibly sailors. And there was this notion of life unworthy of life, that the deeply forgetful were useless eaters, along with the Jews, the gypsies, the gays, and so forth. And you know, you shouldn't be surprised by this, because Western philosophies of rationalist personhood were made worse by eugenics. The center of eugenics is about 5 miles from where I am right now, Cold Spring Harbor. In other words, you're a person, you count under the protective spiritual umbrella of do no harm if you have linear rationality, if you can lock, and Kant said this, if you can project plans into the future and operationalize them. Well, Dr. Leo Alexander was horrified at what he saw, the abuse of all these vulnerable populations. And so he just decided that the best thing you can do is form voluntary associations. I know across Europe now you have Alzheimer's associations, you have ALS societies, you have MS associations, you have spina bifida societies. He determined that the best thing you can do spiritually and practically to protect these people is to form voluntary associations, because you can't depend on the state. You've got to have strong, committed individuals who really put themselves on the line for these populations. And by the way, as far as doctors go, disability research indicates that quite a number of physicians still assume that cognitive strength gives life its worth. Well, they're just building on Western philosophy. So my colleague here at Stony Brook, Eva Kite, is the founder of the Ethics of Care. Her most recent book, Learning from My Daughter, about her cognitively disabled daughter, Sesha. It's a beautiful, beautiful book about the conflict between bioethics and the disability movement. The disability movement's always been very nervous about euthanasia, about throwing in the towel on people because of their underlying disability. And that continues to be a major tension. We have a focus here at Stony Brook on the tension between bioethics and disability. So here's a woman who lived a long life. She lived to be 122. She was from France, Jean Clamette. She was in the papers quite a bit. You know, look, she's the poster child for someone getting to live very old and being relatively lucid of mind. Now, why is she smiling? You might ask. I'm absolutely attributing this, but apparently, from what I read on her, when she was in her 80s, she had a very expensive villa in the suburbs of Paris. She sold it to a lawyer for an exotic sum, but he paid it. He signed because she built into the contract, just pay me until I'm dead. So he thought he had the best real estate deal in history. Turns out he paid so much money that he actually died of stress-induced illnesses in his mid-80s. And his kids had to make payments for 25 years. So I don't know why she's smiling, but I'm just guessing. Maybe it's because she made the best real estate deal in history. I don't know. But anyway, this is an example of people who perhaps can live very long. Although I must say that the epidemiologists have been studying people in their 90s now, their late 90s and even beyond. and at least among women, 60% of them have probable Alzheimer's disease. And so the idea that was popular 30 years ago that, well, if you hit 85 and you're not affected, you're probably in the clear, it doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe Dr. Alzheimer was correct. Maybe if we all live long enough, we'd all get this problem. So the Western philosophical problem, it is, I really have to focus on this spiritually. I think, therefore, I think not, I don't exist, I disappear. This is a terrible, terrible thing. And I'm convinced that Donia would have agreed with me on this. Some years ago, in 2015, I was invited to the Indian Institute for Advanced Studies in Bangalore. And this was a conference on the deeply forgetful, using language that I had developed, and also the problem of hypercognitive values, which I also coined. And a lot of wonderful neurologists and Hindu thinkers and some philosophers, one of them from Duke, actually. And so I gave a talk about consciousness and what we should value in people. And I said, we shouldn't be thinking of people as valuable because they have linear rationality. You know, in February, I actually fell in the parking lot behind the medical school and I hit my head. It was very icy. And I was okay, but for a couple of days, I was a bit woozy. I still came into work, still did things, still got along. But at one point, I was out in the parking lot 2 days later, and I had to ask a medical student, I couldn't find my car, do you know if I drove to work today? And they laughed. They laughed. I probably should have been home. Harold would say that. But, you know, we get into situations in life where we lose memory for various reasons. It's fleeting. That's actually called pseudo-dementia. It's not dementia in the full permanent sense. But we do have experiences of pseudo-dementia, but we're still people. We're still conscious. We're still aware of the beauty of the white glistening snow. We can still appreciate the music we play in the car. So I gave a talk about this. And as I was finishing it up, lo and behold, His Holiness the Dalai Lama walked in with Richard Gere, because he hangs out at the Institute for Advanced Studies. No one was expecting him, but he's there quite frequently. So he was in the back, no one batted an eye. He sits down. And after I'm done, he puts his hand down on a table and he says, you're right. No one should devalue another human being, another conscious human being, because their memory has grown weak or because they do not have the benefits of linear rationality. So I really believe in speaking of the deeply forgetful. It's a very spiritual term for me. Dementia, totally negative. It captures a decline from a former mental state, is often used derisively, whereas deeply forgetful is inclusive. It's an affirmation of the continuum of forgiveness, of forgetfulness, even of the mystery beneath a veneer of chaos or silence. Once upon a time in 1995, I started writing about paradoxical lucidity, and I've noticed that there's some very interesting articles in the last 3 years from very good people. In fact, by the way, Harold Koenig is aware of this, studying the reported caregivers reporting paradoxical lucidity when they really expected that there would be no lucidity. Someone's been mute for weeks or even months, and suddenly they're fairly aware of who they are and of their continuity of selfhood. So we miss that. We have to be noticers. We don't notice this. That's the spiritual problem. We have hypercognitive values. We don't notice it. Larry Ladasi wants us all to be good noticers. So mind and self-identity are present despite neurological adversity. Where does it come from? Well, you can say these are just fragments of neurological firing left over, and so be it. But a lot of philosophers and theologians don't think that mind is simply derivative from matter, from cells, from tissue, from brain. They think that there's something unique about mind. Call it mind before matter. In the beginning was the Word. And from mind, all things come. The energy of original mind, and Sir John Templeton would say pure unlimited love, gave rise to the universe. All the Hindus would say that there was a time before space and time, actually, where the Supreme Being existed and gave rise because of love and freedom and the need for relationality to the universe and ultimately to creative beings like ourselves. So paradoxical lucidity. Rudy Tanzi is the Rockwell Professor of Neurology at Harvard. I'm not going to play this little YouTube clip, but you can pick it up. You can have these slides and go to it. But he talks about the pervasiveness of end-of-life lucidity in dementia patients. And he just thinks it's a very mysterious phenomenon, but it's very common. And he's seen it, I've seen it many times. So what do we do with this? Does it suggest that there's something more to the human being than matter? Does it suggest that we are part of a one mind, an original one mind? Does it suggest something more than that? I was visiting some of my Hindu friends in the middle of Ohio at Mount Vernon. They're devoted to caring for people with Down syndrome who eventually in their 50s succumb to probable Alzheimer's. And I asked them what motivated them to be so meticulous, so caring, and they all said, namaste, which means I honor the divine in you as you honor the divine in me. It's the divine that they're seeing. There's a soul that they're tending to. And so again, paradoxical lucidity, this nice article that came out just 2 years ago. Unexpected cognitive lucidity and communication in patients with severe dementia, especially around the time of death, have been observed and reported anecdotally. And they review all this and talk about what it might mean for how we study the problem. Now, amazingly, the NIA, the National Institute on Aging, put out a grant several years ago to study paradoxical lucidity. And that's so interesting because they think if we can figure out what's happening with the brain in these moments, maybe we'll get an insight into these intractable progressive dementias that we could get no other way. We may even find a solution, who knows? I'm not going to play this either, but this would be Leonard Slatkin, the conductor of the Detroit Symphony, as he was about to play Appalachian Spring, Aaron Copland's beautiful piece. And he starts it off, he says, Aaron Copland had Alzheimer's disease, and he lived in Peekskill, New York. And composers and musicians from all over the world would come to New York, and they'd come up the Hudson just to be with him. And he was not communicating. He was incommunicado. And then one day, a particular set of individuals came up, and they were speaking with him. They were respecting him. They were honoring him in their verbal communication, even though they didn't expect anything back. And suddenly he rose up, he went to the piano, and he played 6 notes, which comprised the 2 major chords that are the essence of his great work, Appalachian Spring. And then Slatkin turns to the audience and he says, what was Copland trying to convey? Was he trying to say, I'm still here? Or maybe perhaps he was trying to say, this is what I want to be remembered for. Appalachian Spring. And then they play a beautiful version, one of the best ever. That's a vignette. Aaron Copland, who I met when I was 15 at St. Paul's, my brother and I invited him up from Brooklyn. And he actually helped me do some phrasing on the classical guitar. By the way, I love the musical interlude earlier before. So long as the human spirit thrives on this planet, music in some living form will accompany and sustain it and give it expressive meaning. As you can't eradicate that. It's inalienable. It's so fundamental, so basically deeply evolved and so spiritual. That's what he was saying. Vignette 2, I gave a talk at the Times Center in 2008 and about deep forgetfulness and consciousness as the core of what we value from an ethical perspective and a spiritual perspective. And I got an email from Olivia Hobelzell, who's a famous writer about her own experience as a caregiver. And she's talking here about her mom. In that late stage when words are gone, except for those very occasional moments, she looked at me intently and said forcefully, God, physics, and the cosmos. Amen. So you can go to musicandmemory.org and you can see the videos of people with dementia who come into themselves. Oliver Sacks narrates this, the wonderful vignette of an African-American individual who's really quite far gone, quote unquote, but by playing personalized music that he remembers, he comes into himself, he's expressive, he gets somatic, rhythmic, and believe it or not, about 40% of these individuals who have these interventions, we do them all around Long Island, they actually, for a bit, they'll be able to correspond. They'll be able to remember who they are. They'll be able to say some things. They'll remember names. We do it in Brooklyn at the Alzheimer's Memory Center with poetry. Alzheimer's poets come in and they'll read Robert Frost or something that everybody from that cohort would know. And believe it or not, you can have 30 people sitting there in a head down on their chests, silent and mute. And most of them will chime in, and some will even chime in for a whole verse. So my point is, these people are not dead, they're not shells, they're not husks, they're not gone, they're not absent, they're not any of these things that we hypercognitives think they are. We have to acknowledge that underneath the mystery of silence and communicative loss, they could perfectly well still be there. I like to say, I had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's disease, and I did assisted oral feeding for her in a nursing home when I was in my 20s. I like to say, she still connects with me. Sometimes she'd call me Stevie. I knew there was a lot going on in the ritual of assisted oral feeding. This was before they had dastardly feeding pigs, which were only invented in 1979. But she was absolutely incredible. And I just felt connection. And one time I said to myself, I think Grandma Post, she's actually ahead of me. She's gone down to the train station and she's already got one foot on that train bound for glory. That's how I thought about Grandma Post. And many times, grandkids and adult children have asked me, is Grandma still there? And I never have the audacity to say, no, she's gone. So what do we have? If we get rid of this hypercognitive anti-spiritual philosophy, which is so dangerous, what do we have? We have immense creativity, symbolic rationality, which is more important than linear rationality, emotion, mirth, semantics, music and rhythm, beauty, smell, taste, spirituality. You all know people with deep forgetfulness can still relate to the rosary beads, or they can be stimulated by a hymn or a prayer, touch, consciousness, self-identity. This is de Kooning, the great abstract expressionist. He was really full of anxiety. He would get in fights in Greenwich Village with everybody and their mother. And then for 14 years after his diagnosis by Norm Relkin at the Cornell University Memory Disorders Clinic, he lived in a loft in Greenwich Village and he still painted. He would just rise up. He had his brush, he had an assistant with him, and he painted all these things. There was an exhibit, a posthumous exhibit, and a lot of the reviewers said, oh, he was a shell of his former self. This trivializes his depth. But one reviewer I liked said, from the New Yorker, said, wait a minute. This is a guy who had Alzheimer's, probable Alzheimer's, for 14 and a half years. And for 14 years, he painted. And he knew who he was. He had symbolic rationality. That paintbrush meant as much to him when he was severely demented, quote unquote, as it did beforehand. That's what I'm trying to say. And in fact, I even think there was a spiritual quality to his life that was disinhibited when he became demented. And there are lots of case studies in the neurology literature of people who are never painted before, and then they get demented, and suddenly they're sketching some really very elaborate kinds of things. So he's still de Kooning. I was on the board of the Sterling Alzheimer's Center in Scotland for several years, and we actually founded the dog movement for the deeply forgetful. And so eventually, all people with diagnoses of Alzheimer's in Scotland got trained dogs. and dogs to the rescue. So I was in Brooklyn Heights doing a talk some couple of years ago about dogs. And this woman emailed me later, Meryl Berdugo, bringing Lola to see Alzheimer's patients has made a tremendous difference in helping me to open up the line of communication. Take Marvin, he's 91, lives at home with his wife, advanced AD, has a full-time aide. He sleeps in his own room while his wife has the master room. Marvin walked into her bedroom, fallen asleep on the bed since morning. No one could get him up. I walked in the room with Lola. I put her paws on him and said, Marvin, get up. Look who came to visit. Marvin popped up excited to see Lola. I was able to lure him out of bed and into the family room where his wife was. He couldn't contain his excitement. His wife and the aide couldn't believe it. Lola brought back his memory of his dog, Sparky. There you go. Now, Australia has a huge dogs movement. This is their website, if you're interested, dogsfordementia.com.au. And so I was at a conference, this is like 7 years ago, in Sydney. We actually had about 100 people who were affected with Alzheimer's, but still, ambulatory and so forth, and they loved their trained Alzheimer's dogs. So they walked in a parade down the main drag of Sydney, past the Sydney Hospital and the cathedral. Some of you have probably seen that. And they were doing perfectly well with their dogs. And some guy in a taxi pulled up and he said, blimey, what's this? Dogs are for blind people. I couldn't contain myself. I just couldn't believe it. But actually, we need a lot more dogs for people who are deeply forgetful, because, dogs, they don't give a hoot if you're a little forgetful. They don't care. And you know what? They'll love you. They're loyal. They're pretty good animal examples of agape love. And so that's why C.S. Lewis put dogs in heaven. So I'm going to wind down now, but I was with Joe Foley, a well-known neurologist, and we went to a nursing home in northeastern Ohio. And there was a guy named Jim. I read his biographical sketch on the wall. This is a special care units for Alzheimer's folks, about 30 people in the unit. Talked about his sons, what he did in life. And so I asked the nurse, show me where Jim is. So she showed me to Jim. And I took him by the hand and I sat down with him. I said, Jim, how are your sons? Well, he couldn't, it was a bad question. I should have said, how are your sons, and given their names. No open-ended questions, it's confusing. So I didn't cue him properly with my language. But he couldn't respond, but he had a twig in his hand, and it was painted white, and he put it in my hand. And then he smiled. And I'm telling you, if a smile was electric, that place would have been on fire. And I gave it back to him. And I said to the nurse, what's going on with Jim? And she said, he grew up on a farm, and his dad was a Christian. And he gave him a chore every morning, which was to bring kindling in for the fireplace. So he had gone back, like probably a third of people with Alzheimer's do, to that place of tender, loving attachment. This is John Bowlby, Attachment Theory 101. And that's where he was dwelling. That's where he was living. And that twig was his symbolic expression. Here's who I am. I am my father's son, and I am still bringing in kindling for the fireplace. And then he said to me, with Joe Foley there, and he hadn't spoken all day, he said 3 words. He said, God is love. And then Joe and I wrote back, and we actually wrote a little reflection on this in the Journal of the Cleveland Clinic of Medicine. So look, assume grandma's there. Hope is being open to surprises. Talk even to the most cognitively disabled, calling them by name, speak with a warm and calm voice, with a joyful facial expression, bending down to make eye contact, communicating with them rather than around them. They pick up on kindness. In a world where you can be anything, be kind. And then finally, I'm not going to go into biomedical frustrations. It would take too long, but I don't want to suggest that there's a magic bullet around the corner. I'm not going to go into some of the new drugs. That would be pretty out of place. But I do sometimes say, look, I'm not a doctor, but if you want my recommendation, go with friends to a Greek restaurant, and on the way home, stop by the library and read a magazine. By the way, the meditation has really come into its own. Actually, Harold, you know about this guy, Dharma Singh Khalsa, who's written a very interesting article, I think with you, and maybe a book chapter, about spirituality and meditation and stress, right? So again, 15 years ago, I was at Berkeley with a whole lot of leading neurologists. Only a couple of them believe that stress contributed to Alzheimer's disease. Now almost everybody does, right? I mean, it's one of the major 6 pathways into hippocampal atrophy. So it's amazing how things have changed. Also, I like to say, and this gets spiritual, this is a biopsychosocial condition. In other words, it's a spectrum disorder. It's not just the brain outward, brain dissipation affecting behavior and so forth. There's also something that feeds back. So how you relate to these people, the love you give them, the spirituality you practice with them feeds back into their brain. Neuroplasticity, right? And by the way, there's no drug as good as personalized music or any stable outlier benefit likely due to mixed diagnosis. Anyway, I won't go into this, but suffice it to say, finally, a really interesting study out of Rush Presbyterian on purpose in life for older adults, that adults who were high in purpose, it was a quartile study, high quartile adults with purpose had a 30% lower rate of cognitive decline than low quartile purpose adults. And that's been replicated. So it's very interesting to note that. You got to keep your eye out for pain. There was no pain scale for people with dementia until 2000. This is Greg Sachs at the University of Chicago who developed this. And if anybody ever was screaming and yelling with dementia, it was because, well, it's the dementia that's doing it. That's not it. It's because they have all other kinds of reasons, underlying reasons for pain, including arthritis, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have a lot of nurses, and I just think of Donia, nurses who are trained in pain AD, how to assess pain in people who are deeply forgetful. Again, people who are healthy of mind but older, get them in a primary care unit, and 95% will say, should I become severely demented, I don't want aggressive treatments. This is just a graph on feeding pegs, that people actually live longer with assisted oral feeding, which is what I did with Grandma Post, than they would with a feeding peg. Tom Finucane's article from the Journal of the American Medical Association makes the same point. I went to a wonderful conference in Iowa, the governor's conference, and it was all on how to revive assisted oral feeding because the nursing homes fired all these people. And then finally, I won't even go into this, but I will just show you, this is a bust of Jonathan Swift that's in the basement of St. Patrick's. And this is the ferry that I took home or took to Holyhead, Wales from Dublin Harbor. It was beautiful. And that's the book that I originally wrote in 1995 and then 2020. Then I have this entirely new book. It's entirely new. And as Harold said, it's titled, it's just an evolution in my thought. I was very immature when I wrote this, I think. And I didn't really emphasize the spiritual side of this. So the title is Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People: How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I should stop share. I'm going to stop share, and then we can see each other again. There may be some comments. Maybe I went too long, Renee, but you're the boss. I think you're muted. Renee, I think you've got your mute on. Can you hear me? Whoop.
We can't hear Renee.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Harold is the boss right now.
Okay, Harold.
Well, Stephen Post, you brought tears to my eyes in some of what you said. I'd never actually heard Stephen talk before, give his entire talk, but I'm so glad it worked out that my wife, I have to pick her up from the hospital today. I thought it would be immediately after, but she said not to come until 2:30. So I have a little reprieve. I could listen here, but my gosh, what a heart-turning talk. Heart, So anyway, there must be some questions that people have for Stephen. Go ahead. May very well be that people are just trying to absorb everything you said.
Marla, do you have something?
Yes, can I, listening to what you said, it embodies a lot of what I've learned in 30 years of nursing. And my constant frustration is, how do you transfer that knowledge and experience to the people who are caring?
Yes. That is the reason I wrote this book. And I'm going to push it very hard. I mean, in the 90s, working with the US Alzheimer's Association, I actually gave talks in every single state of the US, and worked with Alzheimer's US to do their national guidelines. And we talked a lot about derisive language. I had not started talking about deeply forgetful people, not until I heard a lot of politicians say, well, you're demented. They're just demented, But, and then our guidelines got picked up in Canada. And so I ended up traveling to every province across Canada, from one coast to the other. And I do a lot of things with people in Ireland. There's a wonderful guy there named Des O'Neill. You may know Des. But I believe in Leo Alexander. Leo Alexander is my hero. He was also a teacher of Joe Foley, who was the one who recruited me to Case Western, the neurologist. But Leo Alexander just said, you've got to get down there in the grassroots. I've never written for other philosophers or students of comparative religions. My PhD, by the way, is from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. So I work with Mircea Eliade, half the year with Joseph Campbell, people of that ilk, and Paul Ricoeur, the great European phenomenologist. But I never write for other academics. I just write for this constituency, and I'm still like that. It's just gives me a sense of purpose. It's the spirituality of my creativity. So I'm going to get out there, and I'm trying to bring this message to folks. We just need to really emphasize it. A lot of times the associations are just so big onto the latest, cholinesterase inhibitor, which might do almost nothing. It's like treating a brain tumor with aspirin. Says Peter Whitehouse, who discovered the cholinergic hypothesis at Johns Hopkins, and who was my colleague for 20 years at Case Western. He'll say it's like, it has nothing to do with the underlying progression. It may help with a few symptoms, briefly, word finding, attentiveness to tasks. So there's so much emphasis on the magic bullet, and we have to break that. I mean, I'm a positive about science, and we may have some outcomes. I mean, Parkinson's is getting a little better, and even ALS has some interesting developments, but Alzheimer's, I really think Dr. Alzheimer may have been correct. This may just be part of brain aging, and then we have to, sort of come around on a scale of 1 to 10. If the most recent cholinesterase inhibitors, which will go unnamed, given that this is a conference, when we actually was involved with Peter at Case Western in the multi-site study of some of these cholinesterase inhibitors. And the idea was this would be the panacea, that somehow you'd beef up the amount of acetylcholine by doing away with the the enzyme that pulls it apart, and then you'd sort of beef up the transmission going on. None of that panned out. But what we found was that in about a third of patients, you would have a little better attentiveness to tasks. So if you gave them a cup of water, we actually did this, give them a cup of water, instead of having one sip and then wandering off and forgetting about it, which incidentally I'm capable of doing, they would come back and have a second sip, sometimes a third. But that benefit would completely disappear within, a few months, because they're still on a downward course. And they'd have a little better word finding. They could remember the names of some people on the phone a little better, but that also would disappear. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, if a really good drug is, say, a 9.5, I would say insulin for diabetes. What we have for Alzheimer's is probably at best a 1. And I think when doctors say, well, they had a patient who plateaued on this. No, untrue. Those are always outliers. And those are generally cases, as we look at them more carefully, of mixed diagnosis. So it's somebody who has probable Alzheimer's, but they also have multi-infarct dementia, which is not progressive, right? I mean, you decline, but you're stable. So, and it could even be chronic traumatic encephalitis. It could be that somebody played one too many hockey games, and they got knocked out a few times, or did not get knocked out. It doesn't really require unconsciousness. So I just feel as though we have to shift the paradigm and do what you're talking about, Marlo, which is to make the world realize that these individuals are still part of the human family, and that there are innumerable things we can do with them. And their creativity, their symbolic rationality, that's all that matters. And we can now, it's not easy, it can be sloppy, and I don't want to diminish the significance of this decline. But on the other hand, I hear caregivers saying, well, she couldn't remember my name. I mean, I realize that matters at a gut level. You begin to think, well, they're gone, but actually don't think like that. Just, come back the next morning after a good night's sleep, try to have a conversation, and you may be surprised. I define hope as being open to surprises, right? I mean, hope is different in every disease condition, right? I mean, in the most broad terms, as Jerome Goodman says, it's having a sense that there's a better future ahead. But for caregivers, it's being open to surprises. And that's where paradoxical lucidity comes in.
Well, thank you for having made the start anyway, to give there are some models that we have now to link into.
Great, yeah, good. Great question. And thank you for your work. Obviously, it's been a lifetime's effort. You've made a big difference. Beautiful.
I have another question, Stephen.
I wonder, I'm sure that deeply forgetful people can be an enormous challenge to families and friends, partners, spouses. But I'd like to point out that they can also be an enormous inspiration. When my grandpa turned forgetful, I was just a little boy, but my mom said, well, he's a very sweet, forgetful man, because that's who he truly is. I don't think that Alzheimer's or similar diseases always sort of turn out the true character, but as a person, I thought that was true. As a young child, I thought, and so to me, it became a very clear signal. If you ever lose the capacity sort of to control what you think, what you say, you better be real. And I think I still am in many ways. And so I think we often see not just the the person itself as being demented, as negative, but we still see their influence on our world, on our families, as some sort of negative influences, and often don't see how caring for an elderly person can train a person to be loving, kind,
Yes.
understand
Yes.
that what somebody says doesn't always mean me as a person.
I totally agree. And, I think one reason people feel a little threatened by the deeply forgetful is because the deeply forgetful teach us. They teach us the most important ethical spiritual lesson of all time. Human beings are interdependent creatures. You came into this life, or, you were totally dependent. Human beings are dependent for a longer period than any other primate, right? Totally dependent. And when we fall ill, we're totally dependent. When I smashed my head and got a concussion in February, I probably should have been in the hospital, actually. But I was really totally dependent in a way on a lot of people. I was asking questions about where I was. It was just terribly irresponsible. Harold is never going to let me forget this. But we are so interdependent, and yet we live under the illusion. When we grow old, with exceptions, of course, but we become more highly interdependent. And so it's interdependence, and they teach us vulnerability. Okay, so human beings, the real state of humanity is interdependence and vulnerability. I mean, we create this veneer of hyper independence and hyper invulnerability. But that's actually, as Kierkegaard would say in the concept of anxiety, he would say that's all a lie. He said spirituality begins when illness strikes like a wave through the porch, and suddenly you realize all of your illusions, that all of your expectations, all of your pathways, all of your everyday activities, the things you get up in the morning, go to the bathroom, brush your teeth, get in your Jeep, whatever, go through the day, the routinization. He said the routinization is false consciousness. That's just us trying to protect ourselves. And the Buddhists would agree with this too, from the reality that what makes us happy, the routines we have today, they're actually going to disappear, And so we have to kind of come to terms with that. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about preparing for death, this is a really great tape of his that I show our students here, Facing Death and Dying Well. He says, you've really got to meditate on this and pray about it and think it through, because ultimately it's interdependence and vulnerability that defines the essential human condition. That's what we learn. So I learned that from my grandmother, So thank you.